Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halacha shir. We're talking about astrology, that is, the attitudes of the great poskim towards astrology, and we've seen a big split among the great authorities, those in favor of, those who are supporters of the validity of astrology and followers of various astrological theories, as opposed to those great authorities who are strongly opposed and rejecting everything. Now, we've seen how this plays out in terms of two major approaches, pro and con. We've seen a number of middle approaches, those accepting some elements and rejecting other elements of astrology. And last time, we began talking about the implications, the hashlachot, the ramifications of astrology in specific halachic contexts. The first halachic context which we began with was Kiddush on Leil Shabbos. Now this turns out to be a critical issue because if Kiddush in Leil Shabbos, if Friday night Kiddush is dependent upon the movement of astral bodies, then we are utilizing an astrological concept in order to establish a halacha. And that's something which is pretty important to establish. Well, let's see if I can get the sources on the screen again. Let me increase the size and make it look nice. Last week, at the end of the shir, we began speaking about this passage in the Orach Chaim, in the Shulchan Aruch, and what we learned last week is that Kiddush, Leil Shabbos, requires Yimaher, requires us to be quick. You have to hurry up. That is, when you come home from shul, you have to make Kiddush quickly. The words of the Shulchan Aruch, and we saw this last week, Kisha Yavo Leveto, when you come home, you notice how male-oriented the Shulchan Aruch is. When you come home from shul, speaking to the men, because they're the ones who went to shul. Kisha Yavo Leveto, when you return home from shul, Yimaher, you quickly eat right away. You have to make Kiddush right away. The reason is because presumably many people in the community have invited the poor to be eating with them at their Shabbos table. The poor are hungry. That's the reason you invited them, is because they need a good meal. They are hungry, and therefore you shouldn't keep them waiting. You should begin eating right away when you come home from shul, because the guests are probably hungry. Okay, we saw this last week. Now, the idea of the Shulchan Aruch that Kiddush has to be made quickly when you return home from shul, when you return home from the synagogue on Friday night, that's a question which turns out to be the subject of a lot of discussion. How quick is quick? How quickly do we have to make Kiddush? Let's see if I can get the Magen Avram on the screen. Here goes. Magen Avram. Magen Avram is surely the single most important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, at least in Ashkenaz circles. His family name was Gambiner. If you talk about the opinion of Rav Avraham Gambiner, no one in the Yeshiva world will know who you're talking about. You have to call him by the name of his famous commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Magen Avram. Now, the Magen Avram lived in 17th century Poland, and therefore is particularly influential in Ashkenaz circles, particularly in East European Ashkenaz circles. There are other great commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, like the Taz, which come from Central or Western Europe, and therefore have more influence on the Ashkenaz Jews from Central and Western Europe, those from Germany, those from France, those from England, but surely in Eastern Europe, the Magen Avram, surely in Eastern Europe, the Magen Avram that we're about to talk about is so important. Indeed, the Mishnah Brura, and we're going to come back to the opinion of the Mishnah Brura a little bit later this evening. The Mishnah Brura systematically brings the opinions of the Magen Avram. The opinions of the Magen Avram were very weighty in the eyes of the Mishnah Brura. Not only the Mishnah Brura, the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal HaTanya, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, slavishly brings the opinions of the Magen Avram over and over and over, very systematically, over and over again. In fact, when you read the words of the great Ashkenaz later poskim, the text of the Shulchan Aruch and the text of the Magen Avram are so fused together, it's sometimes difficult to tell exactly where the Shulchan Aruch ends and the commentary of the Mishnah, the commentary of the Magen Avram begins, the way it's quoted by many of the Acharonim. You have to go look up the text if you're interested to see exactly which part of the quote is the Shulchan Aruch and which part of the quote is the Magen Avram. The Shulchan Aruch together with the Magen Avram was viewed as a single unified whole by many of the great Ashkenaz poskim. Let's see what he says about our issue. We're very impressed about how important he is. Katav b'Tikunei Shabbos. It says in the Tikunei Shabbos. Now, Tikunei Shabbos is a mystical work which comes from the disciples of the Arizal. The Arizal, let's get that spelled correctly on chat. The Arizal, family name Luria, Rav Yitzchak Luria, was the great Kabbalist of Tzfat in the golden age of Kabbalism in Tzfat, immediately after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in the beginning of the 17th century. He is surely the greatest all-time Jewish Kabbalist, the greatest all-time Jewish mystics, and his disciples. We don't have any works, we don't have any writings from the Arizal himself, but his disciples put together a whole series of books in which they present to us the mystical doctrines of their great rabbi, the Arizal. And the Tikunei Shabbos is one of them. Now, our author, the Magen Avram, is about to refer to the Tikunei Shabbos, to this great mystical work, which was written by the disciples of the Arizal in Tzfat, early 17th century. Now we've already encountered in these first three words, Katav b'Tikunei Sofer, Katav b'Tikunei Shabbos, the very fact that the Magen Avram is about to refer to us refer us to the Tikunei Shabbos, to this mystical work. Right here at the beginning, we have something which is surprising and important and of great interest. Prior to the Magen Avram, late 17th century, prior to the Magen Avram, Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism represented one body of wisdom. Talmudic literature, and halacha, Jewish law, represented another body of wisdom. And these were two separate bodies of wisdom. The Kabbalistic, mystical wisdom was viewed as a body of material which taught us about the nature of the universe, the way the universe works, the inner workings of the universe, the way the universe interacts with the commandments of the Torah. In short, the mystical Kabbalistic doctrines up till the time of the Magen Avram were always thought of as being hashkafic in nature. They were always thought of as teaching us how to view the world, how to understand the world, how to understand physical reality in which we live, and how it interacts with the spiritual reality of Torah. But it was not teaching us what to do, what not to do, what is normative, what to do, what not to do, what is normative. That is the job of halachic literature. And these two were separate bodies. The Magen Avram, and we're about to look at his text, the Magen Avram was the first of the great poskim to systematically quote mystical doctrines during halachic discussions. The Magen Avram we're about to look at, the 17th century, was the first of the great poskim to systematically refer to Kabbalistic mystical ideas as part of the halachic discourse, leading to conclusions about what you should do, what you shouldn't do, what is normative in Jewish practice. The Magen Avraham was the first to unite these two separate bodies of wisdom, and that's what he's about to do here. Once he brought all of the mystical Kabbalistic doctrines into the realm of halachic discussion, once he did that, then all the subsequent rabbis down to this very day have followed his lead, and that's become more or less standard practice in the rabbinic world now. Now, what does it say in the Tikkun Shabbos? What does it say in that mystical book that comes from the disciples of the Arizal? It says there, Shia Kadesh Kodem Alayla, that you should make Kiddush before nightfall. How did it work? Back in those days, up to the 17th century, from antiquity up to the 17th century, all the Jewish communities everywhere in the world, in North Africa, in Iraq, in Europe, all the Jewish communities everywhere in the world up to and including the 17th century, they were all praying the evening prayer, Ma'ariv. They were all praying Ma'ariv, the evening prayer before sunset. The reason they were davening the evening prayer, Ma'ariv, before sunset, was because they wanted to get home before it got dark. Back in those days, they didn't have artificial lighting for the streets. There weren't street lights back in those days, and you wanted to be home in your house before nightfall. And therefore, since it is permissible, according to all of the Talmudic sources, since it is permissible to daven Ma'ariv, to pray the evening prayer, beginning 1¼ hours before sunset, 1¼ hours before sunset, that's the earliest one is allowed to daven the evening prayer. That's what they were doing, and then they would have time to scurry home, to get home before it got dark. And it says in the Tikkun Zohar that since you are davening Ma'ariv, the evening prayer, the Friday night prayer before sunset, then you come home right away after the prayers in the synagogue, and you make Kiddush on a cup of wine before nightfall. Now, this is a very interesting thing. According to this, it's possible to make Kiddush for Shabbos before it is really Shabbos. Shabbos begins at nightfall on Friday night. Yeah, sure. It depends where you live. As you point out in chat, there are many communities today which are doing exactly this. It depends largely on how far north or how far south you are, in which latitude. In the northern latitudes, in the summer, sunset is very late at night. Similarly, in the southern hemisphere, the further south you go, in the southern hemisphere, so in the summer, their seasons are reversed, but in the southern hemisphere summer, Shabbos begins very late at night, and particularly if you have small children at home, it's hard or impossible to keep them awake for the evening meal. So you pray, and you come home before sunset, and you make Kiddush before sunset. The idea is as follows. Tosefet Shabbos, let's get that idea spelled correctly. Tosefet Shabbos, adding to Shabbos, that is beginning Shabbos early, before it's sunset, is a possibility. We have the possibility of being Makadesh. We have the possibility of sanctifying some extra time on late Friday afternoon before sunset. We have the possibility of sanctifying some extra time and transforming that period of time from Friday afternoon into Shabbos. The Kedusha, the sanctity of Shabbos, begins when we declare it to begin. If we don't declare it to begin, it begins by itself at nightfall. But if we declare the sanctity of Shabbos to begin earlier, then the sanctity of Shabbos will begin when we declare it to begin, and all the prohibitions of Shabbos will fall in place, everything which is prohibited on Shabbos will become prohibited when we declare it to become prohibited before nightfall on Friday night. And if we fail to declare the sanctity of Shabbos to begin, so it'll begin by itself at nightfall, but you can add more time if you want. The amount of time you could add is up to an hour and a quarter before sunset. Remember that when the poskim talk about an hour and a quarter, they don't mean 1 hour 15 minutes according to our clock. They mean 1 hour 15 minutes according to the halachic clock. And the halachic clock, the length of the hour is long in the summer and short in the winter. The halachic hour is 1/12 of the period between sunrise and sunset. The period between sunrise and sunset is fairly short in the winter, fairly long in the summer. 1/12 of the period between sunrise and sunset is a relative hour, is a halachic hour, and it's 1 1/4 of those relative hours, 1 1/4 of those halachic hours, which is the earliest that Shabbos can be accepted on Friday afternoon. If someone accepts Shabbos earlier than that, the acceptance of Shabbos is meaningless and of no standing. Shabbos can be accepted, the Kedusha can be introduced into that period of time only from Plag Mincha Ulamala, only from 1 1/4 relative hours before sunset, and ongoing from that point in time. If you're traveling somewhere and you're making Shabbos without a community, if you're part of a community, so a local rabbi has figured out when the correct times are, you just do what the community does. But if you're traveling and you're someplace where there is no Jewish community, and you want to figure out what the earliest time you can begin Shabbos on Friday afternoon is, well, there are plenty of online halachic calendars that you can refer to, where you tell them the city you're in, or if you're not in a city, you can tell them the latitude and the longitude where you find yourself, and the algorithm on the website will calculate for you the earliest time that you're able to accept Shabbos. Technically speaking, what we're talking about is called in Hebrew Plag Mincha. There we got spells on chat. If you enter one of the internet sites which gives you online calendars, you look for the time of Plag Mincha, the time of Plag Mincha, the earliest time that Shabbos can be accepted on Friday afternoon in whatever city you're located, whatever latitude and longitude you happen to be. So that's what they were doing in Tzfat back in the golden age of mysticism in Tzfat, back in the days when the Arizal and his disciples were active there. Now, why is it important to make Kiddush before nightfall? Why do the mystics insist on that? Because B'tchilas Halayla, B'tchilas Leil Shabbos, at the beginning of Friday night, once night falls, at the beginning of Friday night, when Shabbos begins, assuming you don't accept Shabbos earlier, when Shabbos begins by itself at nightfall on Friday night, at the beginning of Friday night, Hu Mazal Ma'adim. That's the time when Mars is ascendant. Each of the celestial bodies has a time during the day when they are ascendant, when their influence is felt here on Earth. The time when the influence of Mars is felt is at the very beginning of Friday night, the very beginning of Shabbos. Mars is, of course, the red planet, as everyone knows. The Hebrew name Ma'adim, the Hebrew name for the planet is Ma'adim, the red one. The red planet, that's what we call Mars in English. It's the red planet of war, the planet of bloodshed, a planet which has nefarious influence upon the earth when it is ascendant. Well, it follows, therefore, that you don't want to initiate Shabbos. You don't want to begin Shabbos with Kiddush on a cup of wine during the hour when Mars is ascendant, and that's the very first hour of dark, the very first hour after nightfall on Friday night. Make Kiddush before that. Come home from shul quickly, make Kiddush before sunset, and all will be well. B'sof Yom Vav, at the end of Friday, Hu Mazel Tzedek, that's the time for Saturn. That's the time when Saturn is ascendant. Lachein Yekadesh, therefore you should make Kiddush under the ascendancy of Saturn before Mars has its influence. Ken Katav B'Tshuvas Maharil, this idea of avoiding Kiddush under the ascendancy of Mars is not only found in the writings of the great disciples of the Arizal, the same idea is found in the writings of the Maharil, and the reason it's important for the Magen Avram to quote both of these sources is because the great disciples of the Arizal were principally Sfaradim. The Maharil, who agrees entirely with this issue, he was Ashkenazi. So the Magen Avram quotes both of these in order to demonstrate to us that the idea is embraced both by Sfaradim and by Ashkenazim, that Kiddush should be made before nightfall on Friday night so as to avoid the nefarious influence of the planet Mars. Okay. Now he bases all this on the Tikkunei Shabbos. Let me quote for you the words of Tikkunei Shabbos. Here's the text of that great mystical work which he is basing himself on. It says as follows: Mitzvah lahakdim lekadesh hayom. It's a mitzvah to make Kiddush as early as you can. We already said that one reason for that is in order to be able to eat the meal quickly, to begin the meal quickly, so that the poor people who are hungry will be able to start eating. That's one reason to start the meal early. But there's another reason to start the meal right away. There's another reason to make Kiddush and start eating right away, because by doing so, you are increasing the length of Shabbos. You are beginning Shabbos before nightfall, and therefore you have sanctified a little part of late Friday afternoon for Shabbos. You've increased the length of Shabbos. You've increased the Kedusha, the sanctity of the Yom. That's another reason why one should hurry up, make Kiddush, and start eating before nightfall. Kodem sheyavo memshelet, you make Kiddush before the control of the evil angel comes upon us. You don't want the evil angel to have influence upon us. Kochav ma'adim b'tchilas leil Shabbos, the evil angel and the evil planet ma'adim, they will influence us at the beginning of Friday night. You want to make Kiddush and start the meal before that. Elu hashnei malachim, malavim lo leveito, the two angels which accompany every Jew home from the synagogue. You know, in most Jewish communities, as far as I know, in all the Jewish communities, the Friday night meal begins with singing Shalom Aleichem. To whom are we saying Shalom Aleichem? Whom are we greeting? We're greeting the two angels which accompany us home from the synagogue every Friday night. Who are those two angels? Well, the Tikkunei Sofer, the Tikkunei Shabbos, is happy to give us their names. Here are the names of the two angels who accompany us home every Friday night. You'll notice that the names of the angels are very indicative of their powers. The first angel has a name which incorporates the idea of tzedek. The first angel has a name which incorporates the idea of justice and righteousness. That's a good angel who comes with you home every Friday night from the synagogue. The second angel who accompanies everyone home from synagogue is a bad one, a destructive angel, a nefarious angel. In passing, you have just learned that the song, Shalom Aleichem, which is sung in, as far as I know, every Jewish community at the beginning of the Shabbos meal before making Kiddush, this is a song which has its origin in the great mystical scholars of Tzfat in the days of the Arizal. The song has to do with the mystical angels who accompany us home from the synagogue. All this is part of the mystical wisdom, part of the Kabbalistic mystical doctrine of the Arizal and his great disciples, and the song Shalom Aleichem is part of that mystical Kabbalistic tradition coming from Tzfat in the early 17th century. Well, the good angel, the one whose name is rooted in justice, the good angel, Mishamesh B'Sha'a Achrona Shel Erev Shabbos. The good angel is the angel who is in charge of the last hour of Friday before Shabbos begins. Memshalto al Kochav Tzedek, and he is connected with the influence of Saturn. The bad angel, on the other hand, the nefarious, destructive angel, which accompanies everyone home on Leil Shabbos, he has his power at the beginning of nightfall on Friday night. And he derives his power from the ascendancy of Ma'adim, the ascendancy of Mars. The first angel is the good one. The second angel is the bad one. That's the full quote. Well, I left some out. That is more or less the full quote from the Tikkunei Shabbos, which then influenced the Magen Avram and caused him to paskin, caused him to decide what he decided, namely, make Kiddush, make sure that Kiddush is recited before nightfall, make sure that the meal is started under a good astral influence rather than, heaven forbid, beginning the meal under a bad astral influence. Remember that part of the theory, part of the doctrine of astral influences, and we learned this all the way back at the beginning of our course, one of the elements of this theory is that it's important to look at the beginning of any action. Any activity you're going to do, whether it's a business deal or planting seeds in your field or harvesting your field, whatever it is you're doing, it's the beginning of your activity. When you first begin to plant the seeds, when you first begin to harvest, when you first begin the business deal, you have to look at which astral influence is ascendant at the moment when you begin your activity. That's the influence which is going to affect the entire activity. So you want to begin the Shabbos meal. Make Kiddush is the beginning of the Shabbos meal. That's what Kiddush is the beginning of the Shabbos meal. You want to make Kiddush, the beginning of the Shabbos meal, under the influence of the good angel, not, heaven forbid, under the influence of the destructive angel. That is what is going to determine the astral nature of the entire meal. Okay, what have we learned so far? What we've learned so far is that according to the Magen Avram, the theory of astrology, specifically the theory of influence of the various stars and their impact upon the various angels, which in turn impact upon our lives here on earth, is so important that the astrological theory dictates to us how to fulfill our halachic obligation of Kiddush. Astrology and halacha have been melded together and become a single unified theory according to the writings of the Magen Avram. That's in the 17th century, and the joining together of halacha and Kabbalah goes back to this point in time, to this passage in the Magen Avram and other similar things the Magen Avram wrote. Okay, let's go one step further. The Magen Avram, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, is so important, and I emphasized before how important it is. It's so important that many great commentaries have been written on the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, and there are many great commentaries on the Magen Avram. In the commentary business, this is called a super commentary. And a commentary on a commentary in the commentary business is called a super commentary. So there are plenty of super commentaries on the Magen Avram. The most famous probably the Prima Gadim and the Machtas HaShekel, which we're about to look at. The Machtas HaShekel is in any standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch. You have the commentary of the Magen Avram, which we just completed looking at. It's on the outside margin in any standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch. And at the bottom of the page, in any standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch, you have the Machtas HaShekel, which is a commentary not on the Shulchan Aruch, but a commentary on the Magen Avram that we just looked at. Let's see what the Machtas HaShekel has to say about this passage in the Magen Avram. These are his words. Seder Hiluch HaKochavim, the order of movement of the stars, and we know that what we call planets are included in what the astrologers call stars. The order of the movement of the celestial bodies, Eino Lefi Sha'ot Zmaniot, do not depend upon those relative halachic hours which I defined earlier. The relative halachic hours which grow during the summer and shrink during the winter, because each halachic hour, each relative hour, is 1/12 of the period between sunrise and sunset. That's not the way the celestial bodies move. They don't move in accord with that clock. Ella Sha'od Shavot. Rather, it's the absolute hours, the hours which we use today in the modern world, the hours of 60 minutes, where every hour is of equal duration, summer, winter, every season of the year. It's the standard hours, where every hour is of standard duration. Those are the hours which dictate the scheduling of the celestial bodies. If you are an astronomer and want to be able to predict exactly which celestial body is going to be exactly where at any point in time, the clock you use for making those calculations is not the halachic clock, but the standard clock. What today in the modern world is the standard clock. Now, the reason for this is obvious. The standard clock has to do with the movement of the sun. You have to look at things from the astrological point of view. The sun is moving around the earth. That's what it looks like from our point of view. And since the standard hours have to do with the movement of the sun, fixed 24-hour days, those are the hours that must be used to calculate any of the movements of the celestial bodies. That's true in astronomy, and therefore also must be true in astrology if you want to figure out which planet is going to be where, and therefore which planet is going to have influence over Earth in any particular hour. It's an absolute hour of a standard length 60-minute hour that we're talking about, not the halachic hours. Imkein, therefore, Divrei Tikunei Shabbos einan amurin ela bizman sheyom v'layla shavim. And therefore, since the text of the Tikunei Shabbos that we just looked at teaches us that Mars is ascendant in the first hour of nightfall on Friday night, that can be true only 2 days during the year, namely at the equinox. There are 2 equinoxes during the year, 2 days during the year where the length of the night is equal to the length of the day. The 2 days during the year, the equinox, when the length of night is equal to the length of day, that's exactly the time when summer becomes winter and winter becomes summer. The 2 equinoxes are the only days during the year when the absolute hours, standard 60-minute hours, agree perfectly with the halachic hours, because the time the time of night and the time of day are equal. The total period is 24 hours, Night is 12 hours, day is 12 hours. Since the period between sunrise and sunset is 12 hours, it turns out that on that day of the year, and on that day of the year only, the standard 60-minute hour is equal in duration to the halachic hour. And since the movement of the celestial bodies depends upon the standard hours, and since the Tikkunei Shabbos taught us that Mars is ascendant in the first hour of nightfall, the two systems correspond with each other only on 2 days of the year, equinox, the summer and winter equinox. Lachein, therefore, the Sha'a Shishis, Achar Chatzos, therefore, on the 6th hour after astronomical noontime, the 6th hour after astronomical noontime is when the sun is exactly overhead. That's exactly halfway between sunrise and sunset. And as far as the standard hours are concerned, that's exactly the 6th hour. Well, when you come to exactly 6 hours after astronomical noontime, when the sun is exactly overhead, and this can be calculated very easily by anyone who studies celestial mechanics, or ordinary people who have not studied celestial mechanics and want to know exactly when astronomical noontime is, when the sun is going to be exactly in the middle of the sky. Those same internet sites which calculate for us Plag Mincha, which calculate for us the earliest that you can calculate, the earliest that you can begin Shabbos, they're also happy to calculate for you Chatzot. Chatzot is the time when the sun is exactly overhead, and depending upon what city you're in and what the date is and what the latitude and longitude is, the Chatzot will vary from place to place and from time to time. Well, 6 hours after that, Mishamesh Tzedek. 6 hours after that is when Saturn is going to be ascendant. The Imkain, therefore, Bisman she'ein yom v'layla shavim. Therefore, during the rest of the year, aside from those 2 days, when night and day are equal, every other day of the year, Lesa l'divrei tikkunei Shabbos. Therefore, every other day of the year, the words of the Tikkunei Shabbos don't actually apply, because the rule is that Mars, the nefarious, the bad planet, and the bad angel, which gets its power from Mars, they are in control of the 7th hour after astronomical noontime, and that's sometimes going to be earlier in the evening, later in the evening. It depends upon whether it's summer or winter. It depends upon how early sunset is. But the bad powers are exactly 7 hours after astronomical noontime in the winter. That's going to be later at night. In the summer, it's going to be earlier, but that is what we have to calculate. It follows, therefore, that if you want to avoid the bad influence of Ma'adim, you have to make this calculation and figure out when noontime is, and count 7 absolute hours later, our standard hours, 7 standard hours later, and that will tell you when not to make Kiddush. Let's go one step further. The Mahariach that we're about to look at is probably the most influential collection of Hasidic minhagim. There are plenty of books out there which collect together the minhagim, the practices of every Jewish community imaginable. But as far as Hasidic communities are concerned, this is the standard. Let's see what he has to say about this. Yeah, if you make Shabbos in the summer, so Shabbos is going to begin well after the time of Mars. If you make Shabbos in the winter, the influence of Mars will fall on Shabbos after nightfall. So it depends upon the season. Well, let's see how the Mahariach works this out. And the text we're about to look at, is the most common, by far the most common approach of Hasidic communities to understanding what's going on here. Let's see the way the Hasidim look at things. First, he quotes the Magen Avram that we already saw. Then he quotes the Machzor HaShekel that we just saw on the previous screen. And then he says as follows, these are his words. Hine, behold, imki bivadai ra'ui l'nizeh bazeh, even though surely it is proper and correct to be careful about this, even though it's proper and correct to avoid beginning the Shabbos meal under the influence of Mars, even though it's correct to be careful and not begin the Shabbos meal under the influence of Mars. However, Kol Arum Ya'aseh B'das, what it says in the verse in the Torah is a clever person, Arum, a clever person must do what he does with his das, with his mind. A clever person will use his mind, will use his intellect in order to do things properly. Because Misha Yesh Etzel Shulchano Orchim Aniyim, because anyone who has poor guests invited to his Shabbos table, anyone who is doing an act of kindness, an act of chesed for the poor, inviting them to a good Shabbos meal so they'll have food to eat, anyone who is doing that great mitzvah, Asher hem re'evim u'tzmeim, the poor people are hungry and thirsty. They don't get enough food all week long, and they're very happy to be invited to your good Shabbos meal, but they are hungry and thirsty. Im kain, therefore, gadol koach matanat aniyim, therefore, the power of the mitzvah of doing kindness with the poor, and that's a great mitzvah. You don't need me to tell you how great the mitzvah of tzedakah is. It's one of the most powerful, one of the greatest mitzvahs in the book. The power of the mitzvah of tzedakah, the power of the mitzvah of doing kindness with the poor, the power of that mitzvah will transform the evil influence of Mars and the bad angel, which flows from that influence, into good. And that is the power of mitzvahs in general. We're looking only at one specific passage from the Mahariach, but the same idea is repeated in many other contexts. The idea is there are evil influences of the stars. There are things that you shouldn't start doing. There are activities which you should avoid beginning under the influence of a bad star, because things are not going to work out happily. If you begin the harvest, or you begin planting, or you begin your business deal under the influence of a bad star, you surely want to avoid that, unless, of course, what you are doing is a mitzvah. If you are engaged in a mitzvah, then the power of the mitzvah will surely overcome the bad influence of the stars. And therefore, according to the Mahariach, as long as you are doing a great mitzvah, for example, you have invited poor people to your Shabbos meal, and you're doing them the great kindness of feeding them a good meal all week long. They're hungry and they don't get enough food to eat, and now they're going to get a good meal. By all means, that mitzvah will protect you, and therefore you need not be concerned with which astral body is ascendant. He goes on and says, the text continues, there goes, this is a continuation of the text, Al tashkiach, don't pay attention to the small number of Hasidic rabbis. Do not pay attention to the few tzaddikim, the few saintly rabbis, even though these great rabbis have poor guests. Of course, they always invite poor guests to their table to eat with them. Of course, these great rabbis always perform the mitzvah of doing kindness for the poor. asher ba'o l'chasot tachat kanfehem. These great rabbis always make sure that they're taking care of the poor while they are eating their Shabbos meal. Rubam ein makadshin ad shah zayin, and these great Hasidic rabbis do not make Kiddush during the 6th hour. They wait until the 7th hour after astronomical noon. They wait, these great rabbis wait until the influence of Mars is past. Don't pay attention to those rabbis. Don't pay attention to what they're doing. Ki otam anashim, because those people, asher ba'im lekabel rabban, because people who come into the presence of those great rabbis, yod'im know minhag rabam. The people who come into the presence of those great rabbis know the practice of those great rabbis. The poor people who are invited to the table of the great rabbi, the Hasidic Rebbe, know that the meal is not going to start until very late. The Almanat came bo. They accepted the invitation with the full knowledge that they're going to have to wait an extra hour before eating and drinking. The Toamim ba'od yom, and therefore they'll have a little snack during the day before Shabbos begins, l'shaber ra'avonam, in order to break their hunger, so they won't be famished on Friday night when Shabbos begins. Oh, so it's true that it's the practice of the great Hasidic rabbis to delay Kiddush until the 7th hour. There's the first hour of the night they don't make Kiddush, that's true, but don't pay attention to them. Don't follow their practice, because when they invite the poor to their table, the poor who come to their table know that they're going to have to wait an extra hour before eating, and they prepare themselves accordingly. But if you are not one of the great rabbis, if you're just an ordinary Jew, and the poor people come to your house, you invite the poor people to eat with you, and you're just an ordinary Jew, you're not a famous Hasidic rabbi, then there's no reason to think that the poor people whom you invite know that you are going to follow this mystical practice. There's no reason to think that the poor people who you invite are going to be happy with waiting an extra hour, and therefore you should not wait. Instead, go ahead and make Kiddush, and among other things, you will fulfill the great mitzvah of kindness to the poor, and that will more than protect you against the bad influence of Mars. Shamati b'shem harav hakadosh morenu v'rabbeinu harav Shimon. I heard in the name of the great Hasidic rabbi back at the end of the 19th century. He was one of the big names in Poland, the great rabbi from Yaroslav. That's my attempt to pronounce the name of the village, right? Everyone knows that only people who come from that village can pronounce the name properly. But the great Hasidic rabbi, Rav Shimon of Yaroslav, Kishahayam Mekadesh, when he made Kiddush Friday night, Ben Shah Shishish L'Shvius, when he made Kiddush on Friday night under the influence of Mars, he didn't wait for the influence of Mars to pass. And when he made Kiddush under the influence of Mars, because the poor people who he invited were hungry and thirsty and wanted to start eating, Haya Omer Piyut, he used to recite the following verses. Avarachamim, merciful Father in heaven, Hu Yirachem Al Amusim, merciful Father in heaven should have mercy upon those of us who are very busy and very burdened with affairs. Yizka Bris Etanim, may the merciful one in heaven, may God remember the covenant of Avraham Avinu, the Yatzil Nafshotenu, and may he save our souls, Min Hasha'ot Haraot, from the evil hour, from the hour when Mars is ascendant. He made Kiddush, the Rebbe made Kiddush under the influence of Mars, and recited a little prayer, little verse, one line, takes a few seconds to recite. May the merciful one in heaven have mercy upon us and save us from the bad influence of the stars. And he made Kiddush under the influence of Mars, and the people started eating. Now we're beginning to get some insight into what's going on here. from the mystical, from the astrological, from the Kabbalistic point of view. We're beginning to get some insight. In order to understand the insight, let me remind you of what we learned last week. Last week we learned that the difference between a siman, which is acceptable, and superstition, which is prohibited. So the difference is that the siman is not something we really believe in, but it's just an opportunity for a little prayer. The siman is an opportunity for connecting ourselves more closely with God. Eating an apple with honey, this is the example we saw last week, eating an apple with honey on Rosh Hashanah is not a magical procedure which is going to make a sweet year for you. It's just an opportunity for a little prayer. May it be your will, God, that we have a good year. It's an opportunity for a little prayer, and that little prayer is going to connect you more strongly with God. It's the spiritual connection which comes from the prayer which is important. Eating an apple with honey is not going to do anything, but the prayer, on the other hand, is of spiritual value. That we saw last week. That we saw last week is the distinction between prohibited superstition, thinking that eating an apple with honey is going to accomplish something as far as the future is concerned, prohibited superstition, as opposed to acceptable siman. The difference is whether you use the opportunity for spiritual closeness with God. And that's exactly the same idea which is being expressed in the source on the screen before us now. If you use the opportunity of making Kiddush under the influence of Mars for a little prayer in order to spiritually attach yourself with God, then that spiritual connection is of value, and that is what makes it correct and good. Let's go one step further. How do I get the next thing on the screen? I'm trying. No, it's not working. Here it goes. Got it. Now, we have the Magen Avram, who taught us that the astrological influence of Mars is important in determining how we do things halachically. It's important in determining how to correctly fulfill the mitzvahs of Shabbos, namely Kiddush. And as I told you, many of the great poskim quote the words of the Magen Avram. Among the great poskim who quote the words of the Magen Avram on this point are the Ber Hetev, the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal Tanya, the Shulchan Aruch of the First Lubavitcher Rebbe, quote word for word the opinion of the Magen Avram. That's another way of saying they embrace the opinion of the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram who taught us not to make Kiddush under the influence of Mars is quoted by quite a number of these great Sfarim, including the Shulchan Aruch of the First Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it's therefore not surprising, is it, that the followers of the First Lubavitcher Rebbe, that means the Chabad Hasidim, not surprising at all, that they are very careful, and they are very careful not to make Kiddush under the influence of Mars. After all, that's what the Magen Avram said, and that's what their great Rebbe, the First Lubavitcher Rebbe, said in his Shulchan Aruch, and that's, of course, very important for followers of Lubavitch, for followers of Chabad. But remember the following point. The following point is a difficult one, but nonetheless very important. In learning Torah texts, it is relatively easy to read a Torah text and to be careful and precise and figure out exactly what the text is teaching us. That is relatively easy when compared to the more difficult task of figuring out what the Torah text is not teaching us. Figuring out what's absent, what's missing from the Torah text is not as easy as figuring out exactly what's there. As far as our subject is concerned, this becomes important in the following context. There are great poskim, like the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal Tanya, the Shulchan Aruch of the First Lubavitcher Rebbe, which embrace the opinion of the Magen Avram on this point and instruct us not to make Kiddush under the influence of Mars. On the other hand, the Mishnah Brura, and it's hard to point to a more authoritative halachic source than that, and the Sefer, Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, which is surely the single most influential book about the laws of Shabbos ever written, and the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, Rav Gansfried was the name of the author, surely if not the most influential handbook of halacha on anyone's short list of the most influential handbooks of halacha. A number of great svarim, and here you have a list of some of them, fail to quote the Magen Avram. The opinion of the Magen Avram is absent. And we're talking here about svarim which consistently and systematically follow the opinions of the Magen Avram point after point after point, but on this specific point, they ignore the Magen Avram, and their silence, the fact that the Magen Avram's opinion is not quoted in these forums, is very important. It's easier to notice what's in a Sefer, like the Magen Avram's opinion appearing in the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal HaTanya. It's easier to notice that than to notice that the opinion of the Magen Avram is missing in the Mishnah Brura, in the Sefer Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, and in the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. But these great Sfarim, which are of immense influence, do not say a single word about avoiding Kiddush during the ascendancy of Mars, indicating to us that they reject this opinion, even though they systematically follow the Magen Avram in just about every other imaginable context. In this context, all of a sudden they're silent about the opinion of the Magen Avram. That's another way of saying they have rejected it. Bottom line, the great contemporary poskim, the Shulchan Aruch of Chabad, the Mishnah Brura, Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch, are in disagreement with each other on the question of whether we should or should not be concerned about the ascendancy of Mars when we make Kiddush. As far as the majority mainstream is concerned, surely the Mishnah Brura, Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, and the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch surely represent the majority mainstream view of the great contemporary rabbis, namely to ignore the entire astrological issue entirely and make Kiddush whenever you make Kiddush, irrespective of the positions of the celestial bodies. The Aruch HaShulchan, whom we've quoted many times, writes about the Magen Avram the following words: Hu tamua. The whole opinion of the Magen Avram instructing us to be concerned about astrology is bizarre. Chas v'shalom, heaven forbid, to say that we are under the influence of the stars. The whole idea of astrological influence, heaven forbid that we should consider such a thing. Adraba, on the contrary, Ra'iti b'kadmonim sha'umos ha'kadmonim hayu yeshuvim b'Shabbos yoshvim b'Shabbos b'choshech bochim b'nei she'amazal she'Shabbos morim l'ra. It's a goyish matter, a non-Jewish matter, to be concerned with astrology. But heaven forbid that we Jews should decide anything on the basis of Mars or any other astral body. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God commanded us to light Shabbos candles, and to be happy on Shabbos, and to rejoice, and to enjoy Shabbos, and to show that we are above the influence of the stars. Even though Mars might be ascendant, we are commanded to enjoy Shabbos and rejoice. We are following the traditions which God gave us, and that exempts us from any concern with astrology. How on earth is it possible for us to be concerned with these astrological matters. Haboteach Hashem, anyone who trusts in God, Chesed Yisov Avenu, that's what it says in the verse in Psalms. Anyone who trusts in God will be surrounded by God's mercy, and that's all you have to be concerned about. And therefore, not only do we have all of these sources, the Mishnah Brura and all these great sources, who ignore the opinion of the Magen Avraham, but the Aruch HaShulchan takes a moment to refer us to the opinion of the Magen Avraham and rejects it in the strongest terms as being antithetical to what Jewish religion is all about. With this, we come to the end of our hour today. In Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll be continuing next week. Until then, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom and look forward to seeing you all again a week from tonight. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.